All right. So for module two, we'll be talking about diversity and intersectionality. Again, terms that have often been misused, misappropriated, um, villainized in our modern society. So here again, we have an APA Dictionary of Psychology definition for one term, but not the other. They did have a definition for diversity. This term can obviously be applied to ecosystems and living organisms there, but we, in this context, will be thinking about it as it applies to people. If we think about social identity groups within certain groups, a work group, an organization, a community, and diversity can be very multifaceted. We tend to think of it in terms of race, but it can be ethnicity, culture, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, religion, spirituality, disability, age, national origin, immigrant status. Very relevant right now as I'm making this in summer 2025, and language usage. And then thinking about how people have multiple identities and social identities that are intersectional leads us to our next definition, which is intersectionality. And again, even though they use the term intersectional there, APA did not include a definition of intersectionality. So I found out that George Washington University does have an institute that researches intersectionality in particular. So I thought that their definition might be particularly relevant. Um, I think it's really important, and we'll see this in our readings, to point out that this is rooted in Black activism, Black feminist activism, and academia as well. It's a critical theoretical framework that highlights how power and privilege are differently structured within and across diverse groups of people at multiple and interlocking demographics. So it's all oppression is linked, and you can be disadvantaged by multiple sources of oppression, and those will intersect. You're going to see my cat Simba. He will probably make a little cam meow a couple times when we're recording because he thinks whenever I'm on Zoom, people want to see him. Probably not alive. Um, and so essentially, intersectionality recognizes that if you have two or more identities that are oppressed, you will experience oppression in a very different way than someone who might only have one of those sources of oppression. So we will be, you'll start by reading about work group diversity. So how do we look at diversity in the workplace? This article is about 20 years old, but I think it's still a really nice review and overview of diversity in the workplace. They look at literature over almost a 10-year period. And they recognize that we need to conceptualize diversity in more complex ways. And we need to think about what are the effects of diversity on the process of people working together, not just like in the abstract, but we need to research it, right? And that certainly has happened since then. Here is the reading I referenced 2 slides ago. This is a seminal reading in intersectionality. This is Kimberly Crenshaw. She was not the first one to really use this term, but she was the first one to write about it academically. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar. She was thinking about this from a legal perspective. And in particular, she talks a lot about being a Black woman and how that is different to being a white woman or being a Black man in terms of the oppression that you experience. Kimberly Crenshaw is also known for critical race theory. So, as you can imagine, she is a very controversial figure. She didn't set out to be, she just wrote about things in a way that made sense to her based on theory, research, what she saw in the court systems. Very important piece, very important background here. Then we'll have this great article on Intersectionality 101 by Gopaldas. And you'll see that this is one of the leading authors in this area. We'll have another article by the same author, and is going to talk about intersectionality as a whole, but in particular, from a business perspective. How does this affect marketing, advocacy, right? Things along those lines. How can we start to incorporate these principles into organizational settings, whether those are corporate or perhaps nonprofit? As I mentioned, we'll have a second reading by the same author looking at research. Now, in this program, we are going to talk about research quite a bit throughout all your classes. If you're not just solely reading it, you will be learning to do some of it through our statistics-based courses. And so this talks about, okay, if we're going to research diversity, we can't keep looking at just race, just sex, even just sexual orientation or things like that. We need to think about in our research this intersectional perspective if we want to be accurate in how we are studying things. So really important to think about this in terms of how this impacts science. Then you'll have a reading about rethinking diversity management. So how does intersectionality play into how we manage other people, how diversity networks are used within companies. And basically, they are going to talk about how privilege gets in the way of progress, of analyzing these things, leading well, things along those lines. And then you will also have a brief Washington Post article written by Kimberly Crenshaw in 2015, so 30 years after her initial writing, where she will talk about why we can't pump the brakes on intersectionality. Because some people will say, oh, well, let us handle race first, and then we'll get to the other stuff. And it just doesn't make sense, right, from everything you've read so far. And so she talks about how intersectionality is a lived reality, whether or not you want to acknowledge the terminology, right? And I think that that is such a vital piece of information to be looking at. Your assignment for this week, your reflection, will be somewhat similar to last week, where you'll be asked to look at your own identity, but you're going to start thinking about it in intersectional terms in a different way to last week, where we were kind of almost like checkboxing it. So I hope that these readings will inform that for you. And I do look forward to reading your discussions and also reading your reflections. Moving assets.